On the afternoon of July 25, 1944, Flight Lieutenant A.E. Wall of the Royal Air Force was flying a reconnaissance mission deep over Bavaria. He was piloting a de Havilland Mosquito. At that time, the Mosquito was the crown jewel of Allied engineering, made of wood, stripped of defensive armament, and powered by two massive Merlin engines. It was the fastest operational piston engine aircraft in the world. Its defense was simple: speed. If a Mosquito pilot saw a German fighter, he didn't dogfight. He simply pushed the throttle, accelerated to 420 miles per hour, and left the enemy in the dust. For 3 years, the Mosquito had been untouchable. Flight Lieutenant Wall was cruising at 29,000 feet, confident that nothing in the Luftwaffe's inventory could catch him. Then he checked his 6 o'clock. He saw a small dark silhouette approaching from behind. He assumed it was a standard German Messerschmitt 109 or Fock, Wolf 190. He did what he always did. He slammed the throttles forward and went into a shallow dive to build speed, expecting the German plane to fade away. But the dot didn't fade. It got bigger, and it got bigger fast. Wall watched in disbelief as the enemy aircraft closed the distance with impossible speed. It wasn't gaining on him by 5 miles per hour or 10 miles per hour. It was gaining on him at 100 miles per hour. As the shape roared past him, Wall saw something that his brain struggled to process. The plane had swept back wings, like a shark. It had a nose that looked like a shark snout. And, most terrifying of all, it had no propellers. There were no spinning discs of metal on the wings. There was no roar of a piston engine. There was just a high-pitched, banshee-like whine, followed by a thunderclap of displaced air. The strange machine fired a burst of cannon shells, banked sharply, and vanished into the clouds, leaving the fastest plane in the RAF, looking like it was parked in the sky. Flight Lieutenant Wall returned to base shaken. His intelligence report that evening was the moment of realization for the Allied High Command. The rumors they had been hearing from spies and secret reports were true. The Germans had done the impossible. They had broken the propeller barrier. The age of the piston engine was over. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had arrived. To understand the sheer existential terror this machine inspired, you have to understand the physics of 1944. For 40 years, since the Wright brothers, aviation had been defined by the propeller. A piston engine turned a shaft, which spun a propeller, which screwed its way through the air. But by 1943, this technology had hit a brick wall. As a propeller spins faster, the tips of the blades begin to approach the speed of sound. When they hit that speed, they create shock waves, compressibility, that destroy lift and shake the aircraft apart. Engineers knew that no matter how powerful the engine, a propeller-driven plane was physically limited to about 480 miles per hour. It was a hard ceiling, but the Me 262 didn't have propellers. It sucked air in the front, compressed it, mixed it with fuel, ignited it, and blasted it out the back. It didn't screw its way through the air. It thrust its way through it, riding a column of expanding gas. Its top speed was not 480. It was 540 miles per hour. In a dogfight, speed is life. A speed advantage of 20 miles per hour is significant. An advantage of 50 miles per hour is decisive. An advantage of 100 miles per hour is not a fight. It is an execution. The Allies, with their thousands of Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Spitfires, suddenly realized that their entire air force was arguably obsolete. If the Germans could mass-produce this turbobird, the air war over Europe, which the Allies thought they had won, would restart from scratch. But the story of the Me 262 is not just a story of triumph. It is a tragedy of timing, arrogance, and materials science. Because while Flight Lieutenant Wall was seeing the future in July 1944, the German engineers who built it knew that they were already too late. The dream of the jet engine had been born simultaneously in Britain by Frank Whittle and in Germany by Hans von Ohain in the late 1930s. But while the British viewed the jet as a curious experiment, the Germans, always obsessed with technological superiority, poured money into it. On August 27, 1939, days before the war started, the Winkle 178 became the first aircraft in history to fly on turbojet power. But the German Air Ministry, the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, RLM, made a fatal miscalculation. In 1939, facing a war with Poland and France, they believed the war would be short. Their current planes, the Me 109 and the Winkle 111, were already the best in the world. They didn't need risky, expensive, experimental wonder weapons that wouldn't be ready for 5 years. They needed planes now. So the jet program was put on the back burner. It was treated as a science project, not a priority. It wasn't until 1942, when the tide of war began to turn, when the RAF and the USAAF began to hammer German cities, that the German high command suddenly remembered the jet. They needed a game changer. They needed a weapon that could fly higher than the bombers and faster than the escorts. They dusted off the plans for Project P1065, gave it to Willy Messerschmitt, and ordered him to build the ultimate interceptor. Messerschmitt created a masterpiece of aerodynamics. The Me 262 was beautiful. It had a shark-like fuselage and a triangular cross-section. But its most distinctive feature was its swept wings. Most people believed the wings were swept back for aerodynamic speed, to delay the shock waves of the sound barrier. This is a myth. In reality, the sweep was a last-minute fix. The jet engines were heavier than expected, throwing off the plane's center of gravity. To balance the plane, the engineers simply swept the outer wings backward to move the center of lift. The high-speed aerodynamic benefit was a complete lucky accident. But a plane frame is just a sculpture without engines. And here lay the seeds of the disaster. The Me 262 was designed to use the Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet. A jet engine is essentially a furnace. The turbine blades inside the engine spin at 9,000 RPM in an environment that is 1,000 degrees Celsius. To survive this hell, you need superalloy metals made with nickel, cobalt, and chromium. These rare earth metals prevent the steel from melting or deforming under heat, a phenomenon known as creep. In 1939, Germany had access to these metals, but by 1943, the Allied blockade had strangled Germany's supply. Germany had no nickel. It had no chromium. The engineers at Junkers were given an impossible task: build a jet engine that runs at 1,000 degrees, but do it using only cheap, low-grade steel. It was like asking a chef to bake a souffle using mud. The engineers tried everything. They invented hollow turbine blades that were air-cooled from the inside, a brilliant innovation still used today, but it wasn't enough. The Jumo 004 engines that powered the first Me 262s were not reliable marvels of engineering. They were ticking time bombs. The average operational life of the Jumo 004 engine was not 100 hours. It was not 50 hours. It was 10 to 25 hours. After 10 hours of flight time, the turbine blades would stretch, crack, or simply melt, causing the engine to explode or catch fire. German pilots weren't just fighting the Allies. They were fighting a machine that was eating itself alive. A pilot might take off in the world's fastest fighter, fly one mission, and land with an engine that was already scrap metal. This was the paradox of the Me 262. In the air, it was a god, flying at speeds the Allies couldn't touch. But on the ground, it was a logistical nightmare, demanding new engines every few days, from a factory system that was being bombed into rubble. And yet, even with these flaws, if it had been unleashed in 1943, it might have stopped the Allied bombing offensive cold. So, why wasn't it? The answer involves the most famous and controversial conversation in the history of the Luftwaffe, a conversation between Willy Messerschmitt and Adolf Hitler. On November 26, 1943, at the Insterburg airfield in East Prussia, a demonstration took place that would seal the fate of the Luftwaffe. A prototype Me 262 V6 stood on the tarmac, its engines whining with that strange, new banshee scream. Standing next to it was Professor Willy Messerschmitt. Inspecting it, with a look of grim obsession, was Adolf Hitler. Hitler was looking for a miracle. The Allied bombing campaign was pulverizing German cities, and the Wehrmacht was preparing for the inevitable Allied invasion of France, the Second Front. Hitler believed that the only way to stop the invasion was to attack the Allied troops on the beaches. He needed a bomber that was fast enough to fly through the Allied air cover, drop its payload on the landing craft, and escape. He turned to Messerschmitt and asked a single fateful question: can this aircraft carry bombs? Messerschmitt was a businessman. He wanted the contract. He knew the plane was designed purely as an interceptor, a hunter of bombers. Adding bomb racks would ruin its aerodynamics, upset its center of gravity, and waste its primary advantage, speed. But he couldn't say no to the Führer. So, he replied, "Yes, mein Führer. It can carry two 250-kilogram bombs." Hitler's face lit up. In that moment, he made a decision that drove the Luftwaffe generals to the brink of insanity. "This is it," he declared. "This is the Blitzbomber, the Lightning Bomber. I order that this aircraft be produced solely as a bomber." General Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, was standing nearby. He was horrified. Galland was a legendary ace, a man who flew with a cigar in his mouth and understood air combat better than anyone. He had flown the Meta-60 262 prototype himself just months earlier. Upon landing, he had famously reported, "It felt as if angels were pushing." He knew that this machine, used as a fighter, could tear the American bomber formations to shreds. One Me 262, he calculated, was worth 5 Messerschmitt 109s. But now, Hitler wanted to use this racehorse as a pack mule. The Blitzbomber order was a catastrophe. It didn't just mean hanging bombs on the wings. It meant redesigning the fuselage to reinforce the pylons. It meant changing the fuel system to account for the shift in center of gravity. It meant developing a new bomb aiming sight. All of this took time Germany did not have. For 6 critical months from late 1943 to mid-1944, the Me 262 program was paralyzed by redesigns and arguments. While the engineers struggled to turn a fighter into a bomber, the Allies landed at Normandy on June 6, 1944. The Luftwaffe, flying obsolete piston engine fighters, was swept from the sky. The Blitzbombers were nowhere to be seen. When a handful finally did arrive in late June, flown by pilots untrained in bombing, they were useless. They flew so fast that the pilots couldn't aim. Their bombs missed the targets by miles. The miracle weapon had been wasted. It wasn't until September 1944, with the Allies already at the German border, that Hitler finally, grudgingly, allowed the production of the fighter version. But the delay had been fatal. The moment of realization for the German aces was bitter. They finally had the perfect sword, but the enemy was already at the castle gates. General Galland, defying Hitler's orders, organized the first operational jet fighter unit, Kommando Nowotny, led by the Austrian ace Walter Nowotny. Their base was at Akmar and Hessepe in western Germany. Their mission was simple: prove that the jet worked. And it did. When the Me 262 finally entered combat as a fighter, it completely upended the physics of air warfare. For an American P-51 Mustang pilot, encountering an Me 262 was a nightmare. The Mustang cruised at 350 miles per hour and topped out at 440. The jet cruised at 540. It was like a car fighting a motorcycle. The German tactics were simple: boom and zoom. The jets would climb high, dive into the American bomber formation, fire a 4-second burst of their massive 30mm cannons, and then simply accelerate away. The American pilots tried to turn and fight, but it was useless. If a Mustang tried to dive after a jet, the Mustang would shake apart from compressibility issues while the jet pulled away smoothly. The Me 262 could dictate the terms of the engagement completely. It fought when it wanted to, and left when it wanted to. The sheer firepower of the Me 262 was also a shock. Most German fighters carried 20mm cannons. The jet carried 4 massive Mk1 08 30mm cannons in its nose. These were low-velocity mine shell throwers. A single hit from a 30mm shell was enough to blow the wing off a B-17 Flying Fortress. 4 hits would disintegrate a heavy bomber in midair. The American bomber crews, who had grown used to surviving dozens of machine gun hits, watched in horror as their wingmen simply exploded under the jet's fire. But the Me 262 was not invincible. In fact, it had a fatal Achilles heel hidden deep within its engines. And the American pilots, desperate to survive, soon found it. The Jumo 004 jet engine was powerful, but it was primitive. It had a very poor throttle response. In a piston plane like a Mustang, if you got into trouble, you could slam the throttle forward and the engine would roar to life instantly. But if a Me 262 pilot slammed the throttle forward, the delicate balance of fuel and air inside the jet engine would collapse. The engine would either flame out, die completely, or catch fire. This meant the German pilots had to fly with incredible gentleness. They had to advance the throttle slowly. This made them vulnerable in 2 specific situations: takeoff and landing. When a Me 262 was taking off, it was heavy with fuel and slow. It needed a long concrete runway to get up to speed. When it was landing, it had to slow down dramatically, miles from the airfield, because it had no air brakes and the engines couldn't be used to slow it down. In these moments, the apex predator was a sitting duck. The American Mustang pilots, realizing they couldn't catch the jets in the sky, changed their tactics. They ignored the bombers. They began to roam over Germany, looking for the distinctive long concrete runways of the jet bases. This was the birth of the rat scramble. Groups of Mustangs would circle high above the German airfields at Akmer and Rhine, waiting like hawks. They would watch for the jets to return, low on fuel and slow. Just as a German pilot dropped his landing gear, the moment he was helpless, the Mustangs would dive. The slaughter was horrific. Bolton and Watney, the ace who commanded the 1st Jet Unit, was killed this way. On November 8, 1944, as he was coming in to land after a mission, his engines flamed out or were hit. He crashed within sight of his own airfield. The German aces were furious. They were being killed not because they were outflown, but because they were vulnerable while parking. To counter this, the Luftwaffe had to do something humiliating. They had to assign squadrons of piston-engine Focke-Wulf 190s to fly top cover over their own airfields just to protect the jets while they took off and landed. It was a surreal scene. The futuristic jets, the hope of the Reich, needing protection from the obsolete planes they were meant to replace. By early 1945, the moment of realization had shifted again. The Allies realized the jet was terrifying, but it wasn't magical. It was a machine with limits. And the Germans realized that having a superior machine didn't matter if you didn't have the fuel to fly it or the pilots to man it. The shortage of experienced pilots was critical. The Me-262 was a difficult, unforgiving beast. It required a delicate touch. But by 1945, the Luftwaffe was running out of veterans. They were putting teenagers with only a few hours of flight time into the cockpits of the world's fastest fighter. The results were predictable. Many young pilots died without ever seeing an enemy, crashing due to engine fires, stall-outs, or simply losing control at speeds their minds couldn't process. But for the few surviving experts, the Experten, the Me-262, offered one last, desperate chance to inflict damage. In February 1945, General Galland, having been fired by Goering for his outspoken criticism, was allowed to form one final unit. It was Gagreband 44, JV-44. It was known as the Squadron of Experts. It was perhaps the most elite unit in the history of aviation. Every pilot was an ace. Many were Knight's Cross holders. They painted the undersides of their jets red with white stripes. They had the best planes, the best mechanics, and they answered to no one but Galland. In the final, crumbling weeks of the Third Reich, this small band of pilots took to the sky to prove what might have been. By March 1945, the Third Reich had shrunk to a narrow quarter of land in central Germany. The cities were ruins. The armies were shattered. But in the skies over Munich, a strange and terrifying final act was playing out. The Jagerband 44, General Adolf Galland's Squadron of Experts, was rewriting the rulebook of air combat one last time. Galland had gathered the cream of the Luftwaffe. These are men like Johannes Steinhoff, Günther Lutzow, and Gerhard Barkhorn. Between them, the pilots of JV-44 had thousands of aerial victories and wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. They were flying the Me-262 not as a desperate defense, but as a pure predator. And in these final weeks, they introduced a weapon that was even more revolutionary than the jet itself. The standard 30mm cannons of the Me-262 were devastating, but they had a flaw. To use them, a pilot had to get close within 400 yards of the American bombers. This brought the jet right into the teeth of the B-17's defensive machine guns. The wall of lead from a combat box of bombers was still deadly, even to a jet. The German engineers needed a way to kill the bombers from outside the range of their guns. The answer was the A4M Orkan, Hurricane rocket. This was a small, simple, folding fin rocket. It looked crude, little more than a wooden stick with a warhead, but it was ballistically perfect. The engineers mounted wooden racks under the Me-262's wings, each carrying 12 rockets, for a total of 24. The tactic was brutal. The Me-262 would approach the American bomber formation from the rear, cruising at 5 and 50 miles per hour. But instead of closing to 400 yards, the pilot would level out at 1,000 yards, safely outside the range of the American gunners. He would aim his optical sight at the center of the bomber cluster and flip a switch. In less than a second, all 24 rockets would ripple off the rails. They didn't fly like wild fireworks. They flew in a tight, shotgun-like pattern, dispersing to cover an area exactly the size of a B-17. A single hit from an R-4M warhead would not just damage a bomber, it would vaporize it. The American crews called it the wolf pack tactic. They would see the jets landing up out of range, see the puffs of smoke from the rockets, and then watch as 3 or 4 B-17s in their formation simply disintegrated. In one engagement in March 1945, a flight of 6 Me-262s equipped with R-4M rockets shot down 14 B-17s in a matter of minutes, without suffering a single loss. It was the moment of realization for the USAAF. If the Germans had deployed this rocket jet combination 6 months earlier, the daylight bombing campaign might have become mathematically impossible. But technology exists in the real world, and the real world of 1945 Germany was a surreal nightmare. While the JV-44 pilots were flying the most advanced machines in human history, their base conditions had reverted to the Dark Ages. Their primary airfield at Munich Ream was under constant, relentless attack. The runways were created daily. To operate, the unit had to use the Autobahn, the highway, as a runway. It was a scene of bizarre contrast. The sleek, shark-like jets were hidden in the dense pine forests alongside the road, covered with pine branches to hide them from American P-51s. Fuel was so scarce that the jets could not be allowed to taxi under their own power. It wasted too much precious J2 synthetic fuel. So, the world's fastest fighters were towed out of the forest and onto the Autobahn by oxen and cows, commandeered from local farmers. The squadron of experts would sit in their cockpits, checking their instruments, while a cow slowly dragged them to the takeoff point. Only at the very last second would they ignite the turbines, roar down the highway, and leap into the future. The pilots of JV-44 fought with a grim, nihilistic fatalism. They knew the war was lost. They knew their government had failed them. They were flying for their own pride and for each other. The unit's unofficial motto was a dark joke about their likely fate, the Knight's Cross, or the Wooden Cross. The end came swiftly. On April 26, 1945, General Holland led a flight of 6 jets against a formation of B-26 Marauders. It was his last mission. He shot down 2 bombers, but as he turned away, he was bounced by a P-47 Thunderbolt flown by an American ace, James Finnegan. Holland's cockpit was shattered, his knee was smashed by shrapnel, and his engines were damaged. He barely managed to limp his crippled jet back to the Munich airfield, landing while under strafing fire. He leaped from the cockpit and rolled into a bomb crater as his beloved jet exploded. With Holland in the hospital, the command fell to Colonel Heinz Baer. But by early May, the American tanks were rolling toward the airfield. The moment of realization was now final. The orders came from Berlin to fight to the last man, to throw the jets into suicidal ground, attack missions against the tanks. But the pilots of JV-44 refused. They had too much respect for their machines to throw them away. On May 3, 1945, just days before the surrender, the remaining pilots of the squadron of experts walked out to their hidden jets. They placed hand grenades in the engine intakes and explosives in the cockpits. One by one, the shark-like shapes that had terrified the Allied air forces were turned into burning scrap metal. They would not surrender their wonder weapon intact. However, the story of the Me-262 did not end in that burning forest. In fact, the real race was just beginning. As the guns fell silent, a new kind of army invaded Germany. These are not combat troops. They were technical intelligence teams. The Americans had Operation Lusty, Luftwaffe secret technology. The British had Fedden's mission. The Soviets had their trophy brigades. They were all looking for the same thing. They wanted the Me-262. They scoured the airfields, the forests, and the underground factories. They found hidden caches of spare parts, blueprints, and half-finished engines. The Americans managed to capture enough parts to build several complete aircraft, which were loaded onto the aircraft carrier HMS Reaper and shipped to the United States for testing. The Soviets captured the production lines in eastern Germany and shipped the entire factories back to Moscow. When the American test pilots finally got to fly the captured Me-262s at Wright Field in Ohio, they experienced their own moment of realization. They had expected the German jet to be a crude, dangerous first attempt. Instead, they found a machine that handled beautifully. It was stable, responsive, and faster than anything they had on the drawing board. But they also found the fatal flaw that had doomed the Luftwaffe. When American engineers disassembled the captured Jumo 004 engines, they were stunned by what they found. They analyzed the metal of the turbine blades and found nothing. No nickel, no chromium, just cheap, low-grade steel coated with a thin layer of aluminum. The American engineers realized that the Germans had been fighting a war of impossible engineering. They had built a Ferrari engine out of tin cans. The American report concluded that if Germany had possessed the strategic materials, the rare earth metals, to build proper heat-resistant engines, the Me 262 would have been unstoppable. The only thing that had grounded the Luftwaffe was not the American P-51 Mustang. It was the periodic table of elements. The legacy of the Me 262 is undeniable. It is the grandfather of every military jet flying today. The F-86 Sabre, which would dominate the skies over Korea just 5 years later, used the same swept-wing data seized from Messerschmitt's labs. The Soviet MiG-15 used an engine that was a direct descendant of German jet research. The Me 262 was a tragedy of timing. It was a vision of the 1950s, forced to fight in the 1940s. It was a weapon that proved that technological superiority is useless without the industrial base to support it. The German pilots who flew it knew they were riding a dragon, a creature of immense power that was just as likely to kill them as it was to kill the enemy. In the end, the Turbobird remains the ultimate symbol of the Third Reich's war effort. Brilliant, terrifying, and ultimately self-destructive. The shooting war ended in May 1945, but the intellectual war, the race for the secrets of the Me 262, was only just beginning. And it was in this post-war chaos that the Allies experienced their final, and perhaps most humbling, moment of realization. It happened not in the sky, but in a hidden forest in Brunswick, Germany. Allied intelligence teams, hunting for German technology, stumbled upon a secret research facility called Vulcan Road. It had been so well camouflaged that not a single Allied bomber had ever targeted it. When American and British scientists entered the complex, they found something that made their blood run cold. They found wind tunnels. Massive, supersonic wind tunnels that were years ahead of anything in the United States or Britain. And inside the filing cabinets of Vulcan Road, they found the data that changed the future of aviation. Up until 1945, American and British designers believed that a wing had to be straight to fly efficiently. They believed that the swept wing of the Me 262 was just a quirk of weight distribution, but the Vulcan Road documents revealed that the Germans had mathematically proven the existence of the Mach tuck and the benefits of sweeping the wings back to delay the sound barrier shockwaves. The chief aerodynamicist for Boeing, George Scherer, happened to be part of the team inspecting the German data. He looked at the German charts and realized, with a sinking feeling, that the new jet bomber he was designing for the US Air Force, the XB-47, was already obsolete. It had straight wings. He immediately sent a telegram back to Seattle: stop work, scrape the design, sweep the wings. The same thing happened at North American Aviation. They were building a new Navy jet fighter, the XP-86. It too had straight wings. After seeing the MES G62 data, they tore up the blueprints and swept the wings back 35 degrees. The result was the F-86 Sabre, the plane that would become the icon of the jet age. The Soviets were doing the exact same thing. They captured the German research and the German engineers. They took the swept wing data and applied it to a design by Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich. The result was the MiG-15. 5 years later, on November 8, 1950, in the skies over Korea, the F-86 Sabre and the MiG-15 met in combat. It was the first jet versus jet dogfight in history, but to a historian's eye, it was something else. It was a family feud. Both planes were the direct genetic children of the Me 262. They looked alike. They flew alike. And they were fighting with the DNA of Willy Messerschmitt encoded in their aluminum skin. The Me 262 had not died in the forests of Germany. It had simply split into two halves, one American, one Soviet, and continued the war. But this brings us back to the ultimate question, the great what if, that has haunted historians for 80 years. Could the Me 262 have won the war for Germany if Hitler had not interfered? If General Galland had been allowed to mass produce it as a fighter in 1943? If the Blitz bomber order had never been given? The myth says yes. The myth says that a fleet of thousands of jets would have swept the Allied bombers from the sky, stopped the D-Day invasion, and forced a stalemate. But the reality, the cold, hard truth of the conflict historian, says no. The Me-262 was doomed by something far more fundamental than Hitler's meddling. It was doomed by the periodic table, the moment of realization. For the modern historian is found in the metallurgy reports of the captured Jumo engines. As we discovered, the Germans lacked the nickel and chromium to build turbine blades that could withstand the heat. The average engine life was 12 to 25 hours. Let's play out the what-if scenario. Suppose Galen gets his way. Suppose Germany builds 5,000 Me-262s in 1944. To keep those 5,000 jets flying for just 1 month of combat operations, the Luftwaffe would have needed roughly 10,000 replacement engines. They would have needed a supply chain capable of manufacturing, transporting, and installing sophisticated jet turbines at a rate that even the United States, with all its resources, would have struggled to match. Germany, whose rail lines were being cut daily, whose factories were rubble, and who had no strategic metals, simply could not have done it. A fleet of 5,000 Me-262s in 1944 would have been the world's most terrifying air force for about 2 weeks. Then, it would have been the world's largest collection of grounded gliders, waiting for spare parts that would never arrive. The Me-262 was not a weapon of war. It was a weapon of prophecy. It was a time machine. It was a glimpse of 1950 technology dragged, kicking and screaming, into 1944. It proved that it is possible to be too far ahead of your time. It proved that a wonder weapon is useless, without the boring, unsexy industrial base to support it. The American P-51 Mustang was a boring plane. It used a piston engine technology that was 40 years old. It was made of aluminum and steel that was easy to get. But it worked. It had range. It was reliable. And America could build 15,000 of them and keep them flying forever. The Me-262 was a miracle. It flew on the edge of the sound barrier. It felt like angels were pushing. But in the brutal, grinding arithmetic of total war, miracles are not enough. Reliability beats performance. Logistics beats genius. And quantity, as the T-34 showed us on the ground, has a quality all its own. The moment of realization for the German pilots was that they were flying the future, but they were dying for the past. The Me-262 remains the ultimate symbol of the Third Reich's failure, a breathtaking, terrifying technological masterpiece that was flawed at its very heart, built by a regime that worshipped power but ignored reality. There is one final, shadowy chapter to the Me-262 story that is often forgotten, yet it represents the terrifying pinnacle of German engineering. We began this story with a British Mosquito pilot in July 1944, stunned to see a jet intercept him in the daylight. But by 1945, the Mosquito crews had taken solace in one fact: they still owned the night. The de Havilland Mosquito was the night witch of the RAF. It flew fast, high, and under the cover of darkness, dropping 4,000-pound cookie bombs on Berlin and harassing German night fighters. The Germans had no piston engine fighter fast enough to catch a Mosquito at night. The British pilots felt invincible, but the Luftwaffe had one last nasty surprise. They took a handful of Me-262 airframes and modified them into the Me-262 B1A/U1. This was the two-seater night fighter variant. It was a sinister-looking machine. They added a second seat behind the pilot for a radar operator. They welded massive, deer antler-like radar arrays, the Neptune V radar, onto the nose. These antennas created drag and slowed the jet down by about 30 miles per hour, but it didn't matter. It was still 100 miles per hour faster than the Mosquito. The pilot who mastered this dark art was Kurt Welter. He was a singular, predatory figure in the history of aerial warfare. While other aces were fighting in the daylight, Welter was taking his jet into the pitch-black void over Berlin. He didn't just rely on radar. He had an uncanny, cat-like night vision. He would fly his jet into the British bomber stream, throttle back his engines to minimize the glowing exhaust plumes, and hunt. For the British Mosquito crews, the moment of realization was pure horror. They would be flying in the safety of the dark, watching their own radar screens for the slow-moving blips of German piston fighters. Suddenly, their rear-warning radar would scream. A shadow would pass them at 500 miles per hour. There were no tracers. The Me-262 night fighter didn't use tracers because they blinded the pilot's night vision. There was just a sudden, violent impact of 30mm mine shells, and the Mosquito would dissolve into a fireball. Kurt Welter claimed 25 Mosquito kills a night flying the jet. He proved that the Me-262 was not just a daylight interceptor, it was a weapon that could dominate the entire 24-hour cycle of war. If the war had continued into 1946, the British night bombing campaign, which had pulverized Germany for 4 years, might have become just as suicidal as the American daylight campaign. The jet had nowhere left to hide, but the war did end. And the final verdict on the Me 262 did not come from a German ace or an American engineer. It came from a British legend, Captain Eric Winkle Brown. Captain Brown was the Royal Navy's chief test pilot. He holds the world record for flying the most different types of aircraft, 487 distinct types. He was a man who spoke fluent German, who had actually met Hermann Goering before the war, and who was the first Allied pilot to fly a captured Me 262 after the surrender. Brown flew the jet extensively at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough. He pushed it to its limits. He tested it against the best Allied jets, the British Gloster Meteor, and the American P-80 Shooting Star. His verdict was the ultimate moment of realization for the Allies. Brown wrote that the British Gloster Meteor was a collection of stovepipes on a wing, heavy, slow, and primitive. The American P-80, he said, was a delightful sports plane but lacked firepower. But the Me 262? Brown called it the formidable queen of the skies. He realized something that the German leadership had missed. The Me 262 was actually an easy plane to fly, once it was in the air. It was stable. It was a magnificent gun platform. Its cockpit layout was years ahead of the confusing, cluttered British cockpits. Brown concluded that if the Luftwaffe had been able to put experienced pilots in the cockpit, men who understood the delicate engines, the Me 262 would have been completely untouchable. Brown's analysis destroyed the final myth. If the Germans were desperate fanatics, throwing crude weapons into the sky, the Me 262 was not crude. It was a masterpiece that had been betrayed by its own supply chain. Brown stated flatly that in 1945, the Me 262 was the best fighter aircraft in the world, bar none. The legacy of the Me 262 is that it killed the romantic era of aviation. Before the jet, a dogfight was a dance. It was a turning fight, a test of nerves, a Knights of the Air duel, where the pilot's skill in maneuvering mattered most. The Me 262 introduced the cold, hard physics of energy fighting. It didn't turn, it slashed. It didn't dance, it executed. It transformed the fighter pilot from a duelist into a systems manager. It birthed the modern concept of the weapons system. Every time you look at a modern F-35 or a Su-57, you are looking at the great-grandchildren of Willy Messerschmitt's Shark. The swept wings, the axial flow engines, the integrated cannons, the radar nose. The DNA is unmistakable. The Me 262 was a failure as a weapon of war for the Third Reich. It consumed resources Germany didn't have to solve a problem that was already lost. But as a piece of human engineering, it was a triumph. It was the moment humanity realized that the propeller was just a training wheel. It was the moment we stopped swimming through the air and started tearing it apart. In the end, the moment of realization belongs to us, the historians. We look back at the Me 262, not with fear, but with a shudder of recognition. It is the dividing line. Everything before it is ancient history. Everything after it is the modern era. It was the machine that broke the timeline,